And we are starting a new series tonight, as Jeff mentioned this morning. We're going to be talking about biblical doctrine, and I have the privilege of opening us up. And so this isn't really going to be a sermon so much as this is going to be an introduction to a larger conversation and a larger topic that we're going to be exploring and hitting the high point, so to speak, as we go along. And it's my job tonight to basically answer the question of why would we as a church want to explore biblical doctrine together? Why would we want to dive into theology together? And that's really what we're here tonight to answer. And by way of doing that, I was thinking of a concept that you may have heard about as it became somewhat more popular because of Hollywood in the last couple of years, but maybe before 2 or 3 years ago, this was a concept that really might have been relegated to the laboratories of physics labs, but has been brought into popular culture in recent years. It goes by a lot of names, such as a final theory or an ultimate theory or a master theory, but probably the one that you're most familiar with is the phrase, the theory of everything. Ever heard of that? The theory of everything. And this concept has deep roots. It goes back all the way to the ancient Assyrian astrologers and Greek philosophers, and it picks up men like Isaac Newton and others, but really it came to its maturity and its thinking with well-known figures that you would know, Albert Einstein in the early 20th century, later on in the contemporary time, men like Stephen Hawking. Here's the basic idea of a theory of everything. A theory of everything is basically a hypothesized, single, all-encompassing, coherent theological framework of physics, that the point of which is to fully explain and link together every aspect of the physical universe. Did you catch that? Let me say it again. It's a hypothesized, single, all-encompassing, coherent, theological or theoretical framework of physics that fully explains and links together all physical aspects of the universe. In other words, a theory of everything is a way of trying to explain how anything happens in the universe. Whether or not something comes into contact with something else or not, there is an explanation of what links everything together. Now, as of yet, this idea of a theory of everything, it really remains one of the great unsolved problems in physics. Physicists believe they're getting closer, and so the work of men like Albert Einstein, his general theory of relativity, this massive kind of cosmic understanding of how gravity and large gravitational fields affects everything, and then men like Stephen Hawking with their work on quantum mechanics, going down to the very tiniest of micro universes to understand how particles relate to each other and interact on each other. And some physicists believe as you take these two frameworks and begin to fit them together, you begin to form a theory of everything. But really, when we stop and consider the goal of a theory of everything, this is really what this is trying to accomplish. It's pretty much, a theory of everything is really just one example of a totalizing explanation. A totalizing explanation for life in this physical universe. How do we explain everything in this world? And so it joins other theories that attempt to understand and answer the same kind of questions from other kind of disciplines. A theory of everything is just an explanation in the realm of physics. You move over to the realm of biology and you have a different theory that explains the same kind of concept as the theory of evolution. It's nothing more than a theory of explaining everything relegated specifically to pure naturalistic terms for the origins of everything that's alive. And then even when we move out of the physical sciences, biology and physics, and we move into sociology and history, we're met with new theories. And each one is trying to answer the same kind of questions, just from a different angle. So perhaps the most influential of the the social and historical theories in the last couple hundred years is the theory of Marxism. We're familiar with it. Marxism started out as a way of explaining socioeconomic conflict. Why does conflict happen in society? And basically, Marx tried to explain class struggle based on a warfare between two groups. There was a group of oppressors, a group who had power, and a group who did not have power. The bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois had all the power, they had all the money, they had all the means, and they systematically oppressed everybody who was underneath them. And so any society, this was a theory that could be applied to any society, was nothing more than an attempt to just answer the question, why do conflicts happen in society? It's because of this. It was a grid by which you could view anything. So the only way to kind of overcome this was for those who were oppressed to rise up and take over and overthrow the oppressors. Something interesting happened in the 1930s, though, and that is that Marxism was adapted. So it was originally a socioeconomic theory. It was originally just applied to the realms of class warfare and poverty and stuff like that. But it got adapted to other kind of social phenomena, and that led to what we call critical theory. It's all over in the news. Critical theory is to sociology and history what general relativity and quantum mechanics is to physics, what evolution is to biology. It is a way of explaining how everything works. Everything works. Where is history going? What are the problems that everybody is dealing with? And critical theory tries to answer that question. Why does anything happen in physics, in life, in society? And what we're seeing is that critical theory is really it's actually a vehicle. It's not really one thing, it's a vehicle. A very convenient and very well adapting vehicle that can be operated by a number of different drivers. Karl Marx, when he was in the driver's seat, it was economics that was driving it. But today we're seeing all sorts of drivers, so you can separate critical and theory and leave a blank, and you can fill it in with a number of different things. Critical race theory, critical gay theory, critical LGBTQ theory, critical trans theory, anything. It is a vehicle. In the end, they're just different drivers behind the wheel of the vehicle of critical theory. And critical theory is the theory of everything that's driving everything related to political ideologies. Here's what you have to understand. Is that Christianity is a monumental challenge to all of these radical, totalizing explanations for the world. Physicists are desperately grasping for a way to explain how everything fits together. Christianity has an answer. Colossians 1, verse 16, for by him and all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Christianity has an answer for what connects everything in the physical universe. All things hold together in him. Critical theorists are desperately grasping for ways to explain struggles in society, the problems that we have in life, the oppression that we see, and it's there. So they try to explain these struggles and where history is leading the world, as they say, in a grand march toward a utopia of brotherhood, equality, justice, and happiness. And the Christian faith already has an answer to that as well. Ephesians 1, verse 7, in him we have redemption through through his blood the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ. And get this, as a plan for the fullness of time. Where is history going? Exactly where God is driving it. And what is the purpose? What is his plan for the fullness of time? To unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. Culture around us would like to have us believe that these theories of everything are the dominant explanations for life. And when you start to fit them all together and weave them all together, they form what we would call a secular worldview. All materialistic in the physical world, to evolution in the world of biology, to even the world of society and history. It's a comprehensive way of explaining the world. And they want us to believe that this is the dominant explanation for life in the world, but really, according to Romans 1, it's actually a divergent explanation from the only true and legitimate explanation for the world, and that's the Christian worldview. And we've heard that word before, and we've discussed it a lot, worldview. This is how we can understand a worldview. Worldview, according to Ronald Nash, it says a worldview is a conceptual scheme by which we consciously or unconsciously place or fit everything we believe and by which we judge reality. So it is a filter, it is a lens by which you look out at life, you look out at the world, whether or not the physical world or the social world, and you understand everything about why things happen and why things are connected according to that worldview. It's a lens by which you understand reality. Now, Gary Phillips and William Brown have taken that one step farther. They say this about a worldview. A worldview, they say, is first of all, an explanation and interpretation of the world. That's what we just said. But then they go one step further. Second, they said, it is an application of this view to life. And that takes it a step further. It takes it into the ethical realm. It's not just understanding the world around us, but it's also understanding how we should thus live in that world in which we understand. In other words, a worldview explains reality, and it also explains purpose within that reality. It fits you into that world and gives you an understanding of how you are to live. Now, it would seem obvious that as Christians we should be committed to a Christian worldview, right? A decidedly Christian way of understanding the world. And that would be a good assumption, but it's not necessarily a given. There are a host of competing worldviews. We've just seen a few. And too often Christians are easy prey to alternative worldviews. And if you want to understand why, we just have to look at some of the warnings that Scripture gives. Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians 4. Paul is setting out here how he has so constructed and so built the church and given it certain gifts. And he's done this for a specific purpose. And so in verse 11 of chapter 4 of Ephesians, he says, and he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So you get an understanding of what Paul is trying to say about why Christ has gifted the church with prophets and apostles and pastor teachers and evangelists. It's to take the church to a point of maturity, to grow up into Christ, to become a mature man, he says, to mature manhood, to the measure of the fullness of the stature of Christ. But there's a reason for that. Why does the church need to be mature? Verse 14, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves, and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by cunning, human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. Notice how Paul talks about the dangers. And we could fill in not just false teaching, but we could fill in worldviews with this. He likens them to waves. The child, when he goes out into the water, my kids have yet to be to a beach with waves. At least Desmond's been there, but he doesn't remember. But at some point, they will be out in the water, and there will be waves come in. And a child, they get caught in the waves, is helpless. They will get tossed about, and they can't help it. And Paul is picturing the helplessness of childhood, and he's describing that as the immature Christian or the immature church who gets tossed around by every doctrine, by every worldview that comes in that vies for attention, that's like a shiny toy, because it's what children that can't protect themselves against those waves. And then he goes on from there, from that picture, to describe not just waves, but he says, by being carried about by every wind. So now it's like they're in a boat without oars. They have no way to steer. They have no way to control the boat. And so they're just driven along by whatever comes along and blows them in the water. And what are these waves? What are these winds? Well, he first calls them doctrine, didaskalia, teachings. But then he goes on and he further clarifies this. He calls them human cunning, literally the trickery of man. And it could very well be, and the root of this kind of word is an idea that has to do with dice. So it's almost like playing a game where you're throwing dice, but it's loaded dice. And so you are getting just carried away into somebody else's trick. They're trying to trick you. You are clueless, and you just think they're dice, but really they're loaded dice. It's the trickery of man. It's craftiness. They're trying to deceive you. Then he calls them the craftiness in deceitful schemes. So you notice how he's talking about this. Deceit, trickery. There's something alluring to these worldviews. There's something that draws us, that makes us wonder, could it be true? And so the church is called to be mature, to grow up into manhood, so that it won't be tossed about like waves on a child. It won't be driven along by wind. Now turn over just a couple of books over to Colossians and look at verse 8 of chapter 2. Colossians 2, verse 8. It says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human tradition, according to the elementary spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." So the picture is even more stark here. Now the believer is viewed as a prisoner of war. It's like the enemy has come in using human traditions, using human craftiness, using human thoughts, and he has come in and he has taken the believer off like he's a prisoner of war, dragged off into prison. But look at what it's in contrasting to. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elementary spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So there is two competing worldviews here. There is a worldview of Christ, and there is a worldview of the world. And that worldview of the world takes on lots of different permutations, lots of different forms, It's not a structure, it's a massive blob that will form itself like plastic to anything that you put it in. But it is there to deceive. It is there to take captive. It is there to drag you off into prison. There is danger, constant danger really, of being taken captive, of being tossed by the waves, of being driven by the wind, by alternative worldviews from that of the Christian worldview. God's people have always been vulnerable to the seductive, alluring thinking of the unbelieving world. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 12, and you might turn there just a minute to look at it. 1 John 2, actually verse 15, he writes this, "Do not love the world or the things in the world." It's a very simple statement. Do not love the world or the things of the world. Now that word world is the Greek word cosmos. We've heard of that word, we're familiar with it. It's at its root, it's an idea of something that is ordered, something that has an organization to it. Sometimes it's just referred to in the New Testament just referring to the earth. At other times it's referring to humanity. But in John it takes on a particular moral sense, where the idea of world, of cosmos, speaks of an order or a system that is inherently hostile to God. It's a world that is arranged against God. And so he writes at the end of 1 John, he writes in chapter 5, verse 19, the whole world, the whole cosmos lies in the power of the evil one. So not only are we not supposed to love the world, but that world that we're not supposed to love is fueled and empowered and in the power, in the control of the arch enemy of God. The world represents an evil system controlled by the evil one and organized against God and against his purposes. And so when John is saying don't love the world, he's not just saying don't love the things that the world does or don't love the desires that the world has. He's saying all that, but he's saying more. He's saying don't adopt the presuppositions of the world. Don't adopt the convictions of the world. Don't adopt the values of the world. And all of those things, the presuppositions, the convictions, the values, that is what forms a worldview. To love the world is to adopt the worldview of the world. And with all the things, remember, the worldview ultimately is ethical. It tells us how the world works, and it also tells us how we should live in the world. Before Eve ever took the first bite of the fruit in Genesis 3, before she ever outwardly rebelled, there was already something happening in her mind. This is important. There was already a fundamental shift in her thinking. God was no longer good, because if God was good, he would not have withheld something good from him, right? So there's already a shift in how she was viewing the world and how she was viewing God. Even before she ate the fruit. God was no longer sovereign in her mind, or else she would obey. Instead of obeying her own desires and seeing herself as sovereign, I can do what I want. So he was not sovereign any longer. And he was also no longer honest, because she had already come to be convinced, not just by the serpent, but then in her own mind, that she would not die. So God went from being good and sovereign and honest to being not good, weak, and dishonest. And that led her to her action. Worldviews have consequences. Worldviews have consequences in your actions. Her shift in thinking about the world and about God and her relationship to him became the foundation for justifying her treason against God. And that's exactly how every illegitimate worldview operates. It is a system that is set up in the mind to justify treason. Okay? Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians 10 as fortresses that people build up in their mind to keep the truth out, to keep the true truth. We have to talk about it like Francis Schaeffer, true truth out. And young people in particular, there's some young folks here, young people in particular are very vulnerable to these alluring worldviews. I mean, many are still forming their worldviews. Think of college students, and Jeff touched on this this morning when we're talking about kind of delayed adulthood. And somehow our culture has delayed adulthood so much that it's not uncommon to find the 20-something-year-old still living in the basement, right? Or the 30-year-old without a job. Or even if they're trying, like we have put a premium on education, right? So we've kind of delayed the adult responsibilities that would have been there in terms of work ethic and all of this stuff because we have basically said in our society it's required, you have to go to college. And so we're growing up later. We're not requiring kids to grow up earlier, and no longer are they required to think like grown-ups when they should. And so because of that, they're going off to college, and they're walking into one of the most, perhaps the most influential vector of secular worldviews out there. And it has been for decades, is the higher education system. Al Mohler, who's the book, The Gathering Storm, is our book of the month. He talks about this, about how teaching in the university system has morphed. It used to be viewed as a stewardship, where teaching was a stewardship, where you were taking young minds and you were helping them to think critically and analytically about the world. And that has morphed in college campuses. So now the new posture of teaching is now that teaching is a mission. It is a mission of secular indoctrination into worldviews that are blatantly anti-Christian. At one point he quotes an English professor who wrote this in an online column. It says, quote, "We need to encourage everyone to be in college for as many years as they possibly can in the hope that somewhere along the line they might get some exposure to the world outside their own and to moral ideas not exclusively derived from their parents' religion. If they don't get this in college, they're not going to get it anywhere else." Now, he goes on and talks about an even more alarming example. Another professor from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, who was responding to some alarming data. And still, data is true that there are red states, there are blue states, but the data seems to suggest that there is a much higher birth rate in red states, and that's to be expected because of worldview differences. There is kind of a demeaning in the family versus a more conservative understanding of the family that honors parenthood and children, and so there is a higher birth rate that's going on in red states, and there are some blue liberal representatives who are looking and going, uh-oh. So we could face in another generation or two a larger proportion of children that are going to grow up having conservative ideals, and they're going to outnumber the children from these blue liberal states. And so this gentleman, in response to that, said these educated urban liberals need not despair, he says. He writes, "Blue America's urban archipelago can grow larger, more contiguous, and more politically powerful even without my offspring. The children of red states will seek a higher education, and that education will very often happen in blue states or blue islands in red states. For the foreseeable future, loyal ditto heads will continue to drop off their children at the dorms. After a teary-eyed hug, mom and dad will drive their SUV off toward the nearest gas station, leaving their beloved progeny behind, and then they are all mine." That should be an alarming statement to every parent in this room. Okay? Now, the newest vector for secular indoctrination is, of course, public school. And so now LGBTQ agendas, critical theory, evolution, they are all being taught to children as young as kindergarten. But you don't even have to go to public school to get, all you have to do is you open up your phone and you go to Facebook or Instagram and you are loaded with secular worldview. Okay, so Those are not the only vectors. It's everywhere. We are living in the cosmos, the world system, right? And that's why Jesus said we are in the world, but we are not a part of this world system. So all of this is just an introduction to this point, okay? This is the point. We all have a worldview. We all have a worldview. Even your 2-year-old has a worldview. It might not be as formed and might not be as complicated, but we all have a worldview. And as Christians, we need to ensure that we're operating according to a Christian worldview. And what does that look like? Well, to answer that, I want to take you to a passage, maybe this might take you by surprise, but 1 John 5. Go to 1 John chapter 5. And look at the second to the last verse. This kind of caught me by surprise when I read it. But it seemed like a great place to start with understanding what a biblical worldview is, what a Christian worldview is. 1 John 5, verse 20, he says, "And we know that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true, in his Son, Jesus Christ." Now, there is so much that we could talk about here, okay? We just don't have time. For our purposes here, I just want to note a couple of things. First, notice the word true. John makes it absolutely clear Jesus Christ is not just the source of what is true. He is the source of what is true, but it's not just that. He's also the definer of what is true. Him who is true. In other words, if you want to know what is true, you have to start with an orientation towards Jesus Christ. And that's the beginning of a Christian worldview. An orientation towards Jesus Christ as the definer of what is true. Now notice something else in here. He says, we know that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true. That should strike. That is an amazing statement. That is an amazing statement. Christ has come, and he has given us understanding. He has opened up our minds to understand something. What is it? The reason he has done that is so that we may know him who is true. Not just know in an intellectual sense. This isn't just intellectual knowledge about the subject of truth. This is relational knowledge. This is intimacy, and it's intimacy with truth as a person. Jeremiah chapter 9, the prophet Jeremiah writes in verse 23, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me." It's the driving point of life. If you want to understand a theory of everything, if you want to understand the purpose, it is to know God in the person of Jesus Christ. That is the driving force of the biblical worldview. No worldview is legitimate if it does not begin and end with Jesus Christ as he is revealed in his written word. And Carl F.H. Henry, who was a remarkable theologian of middle 20th century, he wrote this. He said, "An evangelical theology dares harbor one and only one presupposition: the living and personal God, intelligibly known in his revelation." And that's so critical. A Christian worldview isn't just the belief that God exists. It's the belief that God exists and that he is knowable because he has made himself known. And that's incredible. Foundational presupposition of the Christian worldview is that we can know God, the God of the universe, and that God exists and that he has made himself known. In fact, Carl Henry later in his work, God, Revelation, and Authority, he defines divine revelation in probably the most poetic and most beautiful way that I have ever read. He says this is what it means for God to reveal himself. It says God, he defines it this way: God's gracious forfeiture of his personal privacy so that his creatures might know him. God didn't have to do that. He didn't owe you anything. But he wanted you to know him. And so he graciously forfeited his personal privacy so that you, his creature, could know him. That's the foundation of a Christian worldview. So when we talk about a Christian worldview, we're talking about a worldview set apart from every other competing worldview by the conviction that the God of the Bible is the unique source of all truth, and that all truth relates back to God and his purposes for this life and for the one to come. All truth. Not just some truth, not just religious truth, not just ethical truth, all truth. There's R.C. Sproul, who said a Christian worldview, quote, is committed to the premise that the ultimate truth is the truth of God and that he is the foundation and source of all other truth. Everything we learn, economics, philosophy, biology, mathematics, has to be understood in light of the overarching reality of the character of God. That's the reason why we have a Christian school. Because a biblical worldview doesn't just comprise what we believe about God and the ethical spheres. Everything about life is filtered through the biblical worldview. And so from that core, all of life's fundamental questions are answered. All of the questions that every worldview attempts to answer, but which no worldview can satisfactorily answer, are answered in the Christian worldview. What are the questions? Questions like this: how did the world and all that it has come into being, how did it come into being? By what standard can I determine whether a knowledge claim is true or false? How does or how should the world function? What's the nature of a human being? What is one's personal purpose of existence? How should one live? Is there any personal hope for a future? What happens to a person at and after death? Why is it possible to know anything at all? How does one determine what is right and wrong? What's the meaning of human history? What does the future hold? These are the questions of life that they've been asked since time immemorial, and they are answered in the Christian worldview and the Christian worldview alone. Ultimately, every other worldview fails to satisfy these questions. And people have built walls for themselves. They've built houses for themselves in their minds to try to explain the world around them, but ultimately those houses have holes. And as soon as the fallen world, the winds and the rain and the snow begin to blow against that house that they've created, it all starts to come apart. But not the Christian worldview. Only the Christian worldview stands. So this is a series. Getting back to my original point, that was one big introduction. This is a series about biblical doctrine. And the reason why we want to do a study like this is just not just for individuals as individuals, but as a church. We want to grow and we want to mature around biblical theology. We need to, as Paul said in Ephesians 4:15, what we read earlier, grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. That's our goal. Studying theology is not an academic exercise, at least it doesn't have to be. It's not a tedious exercise. It's not a trivial exercise, and it's not just an exercise for eggheads who don't like to get out in the sun. Not that at all. It is a discipline for every believer. And I guess if I want to make one point, it's this: theology is life. Theology is life. It's life because it is the undergirding structure upon which you build your worldview. If you have a faulty theology, it will come out in your worldview. And if we reverse that for a second, a crumbling worldview, a worldview that doesn't work right, is a symptom of faulty theology. So if we want to form a biblical worldview, or if we want to shore up a biblical worldview, it starts with us together studying theology. Because it's the building blocks of how you understand the world around you. I want to make one other point, then we'll close. And that is that that's part of why we want to do this. The other part of it is this, that theology is life because it focuses our minds and it focuses our hearts on the absolutely most noblest task that we could possibly endeavor to do, and that is to study our God. I love what John Murray said. This is what he wrote about theology. Theology is one of those things that you mention it and most people just go, theology. Give me the Bible, but not theology, right? But this is what John Murray wrote. It says, when we properly weigh the proposition that the Scriptures are the deposit of special revelation, that they are the oracles of God, that in them God encounters and addresses us, discloses to us his incomprehensible majesty, summons us to the knowledge and fulfillment of his will, unveils to us the mystery of his counsel, and unfolds the purposes of his grace, then systematic theology of all sciences and disciplines is seen to be the most noble. Not one of cold, impassioned reflection, but one that stirs adoring wonder and claims the most consecrated exercise of all our powers. It is the most noble of all studies because its province is the whole counsel of God, and seeks as no other discipline to set forth the riches of God's revelation in the orderly and embracive manner which is its peculiar method and function. All that to say is what theology does, systematic theology in particular, is it takes this whole book and it ties everything together. It connects all the dots into a grand and majestic tapestry of who God is and how he has been, is, and will be working in the world to bring everything about according to his will. That's theology. Because in the end, what you believe about God and what you understand about the world around you is the most important thing about you. And the most amazing thing is that our God has, as we said, graciously forfeited his personal privacy so that you can know him. And I can think of no better thing that we can do than endeavor to understand what he has written, but not just as we do on Sunday morning as we go book by book, but also stepping back and understanding the whole. And that's what we want to do in the series that we're going into for the better part of a year. So buckle up, but it will be a time where we as a church and we as individuals can grow up, as Paul says, into the head, into him who is Christ. Let's pray.